In this episode, we're going to connect the idea of network security controls to the reality of assessments by focusing on what it means for controls to actually hold, not just exist. Beginners often picture network security as a set of devices and rules, like firewalls and access lists, but a QSA must think in terms of outcomes. Can the environment reliably prevent unauthorized access, limit the blast radius of compromise, and support defensible claims about the cardholder data environment, CDE? A control that looks good on a diagram but fails under normal operational pressure does not hold, and if it does not hold, it cannot support scope reduction or trustworthy conclusions. The purpose here is not to turn you into a network engineer, but to give you a clear way to reason about network controls at a high level, so you can understand what matters, what breaks most often, and what evidence tells you a control is real. When you can see network security as a system of enforced boundaries, monitored pathways, and governed change, you stop being impressed by complexity and start being confident about defensibility. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber-author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong starting point is understanding that network controls are mostly about managing pathways, because pathways are how both legitimate work and attacks move. In a payment environment, you want pathways that support required business traffic and block everything else, especially between out-of-scope systems and the CDE. This is why segmentation, firewall rules, and access controls matter so much, because they define which parts of the environment can talk to which other parts. A control holds when it consistently enforces the intended pathways even as systems change, staff rotate, vendors connect, and emergencies occur. A control does not hold when it is routinely bypassed, quietly expanded through exceptions, or misunderstood by the people operating it. From an assessment perspective, the easiest way to think about network control strength is asking whether the environment has controlled choke points where traffic is filtered and monitored. If traffic can take multiple uncontrolled routes, the boundary is weak even if a firewall exists somewhere. When you learn to see the environment as a set of pathways and choke points, network security controls become conceptually simple even when the implementation is complex. To architect controls that hold, you need a clear boundary story around the CDE, because without that story, network controls become disconnected technical choices rather than a coherent design. The boundary story starts with knowing what is in scope, which comes from data flow tracing and accurate scoping. Once you know where cardholder data is handled and what systems can impact that handling, you can define where boundaries should be placed so that out-of-scope systems cannot reach in-scope systems without explicit permission. The best boundaries are designed to be minimal and intentional, meaning only the necessary connections are allowed, and those connections are documented, reviewed, and monitored. A boundary holds when it is both technically enforced and operationally maintained, because enforcement without maintenance drifts over time. Maintenance includes change control, rule review, and periodic validation that segmentation remains effective. Beginners sometimes think a boundary is a one-time project, but real network boundaries are living structures that must be managed as the organization evolves. When you architect for maintenance, you create controls that hold under real conditions. One of the most important network security ideas for PCI work is least privilege applied to network connectivity, because it is a direct way to limit risk and scope. Least privilege is often discussed in the context of user permissions, but the same principle applies to network access. Systems should only be able to reach the services they need, not everything they could reach. In practice, this means you define allowed traffic explicitly and treat everything else as denied by default, rather than allowing broad access and trying to block only known bad patterns. A control holds when it is built around explicit allow rules, and when those rules are kept as narrow as feasible. Broad allow rules tend to accumulate because they reduce troubleshooting friction, but they also create hidden pathways that expand scope and weaken defensibility. The QSA mindset values narrow rules because narrow rules are easier to defend, easier to monitor, and harder to exploit. This is also where segmentation becomes more than a concept. because segmentation is how least privilege connectivity is enforced across zones. When least privilege is applied at the network level, your boundary story becomes more credible because you can explain why out-of-scope systems cannot influence the CDE. Another part of making controls hold is understanding that network security is not only about blocking, it is also about visibility, because invisible failures are the ones that last the longest. If a firewall denies traffic but nobody monitors rule changes, alerts, or unusual patterns, the environment can drift into insecure configurations without anyone noticing. A control holds when the organization can detect when the control is being stressed or bypassed, such as repeated connection attempts, unusual flows, or unexpected rule changes. Visibility also supports incident response, because if something goes wrong, you need to understand what happened and what systems were involved. In a PCI context, visibility helps you defend scope and control effectiveness by providing evidence of how boundaries behave. This does not require advanced tooling knowledge to grasp conceptually. It is about recognizing that a boundary is stronger when it is monitored and when anomalies are investigated. Beginners sometimes see monitoring as optional, but in environments where compliance depends on boundaries, monitoring is part of what makes those boundaries credible. When you architect with visibility in mind, you build controls that hold because they are not silent. Change control is one of the most practical reasons controls fail, because network rules are often modified under time pressure and then forgotten. A rule might be opened temporarily for troubleshooting, vendor support, or a special project, and then it stays open long after the need passes. Over time, these exceptions pile up and the boundary becomes porous, even though the architecture still looks segmented on paper. Controls that hold are designed so that changes are deliberate, reviewed, documented, and periodically revalidated. This includes having a clear rationale for each allowed pathway, a process for approving changes, and a habit of revisiting rules to remove what is no longer needed. It also includes clarity about who has authority to change network controls, because broad administrative access can create untracked changes that undermine the entire security story. A QSA evaluating network controls is often evaluating governance as much as technology, because technology without governance rarely holds. When you architect controls with governance built in, you protect the environment from slow drift, which is one of the most common real-world failure modes. Shared services and management planes are also where network controls can quietly fail, because they create high-impact pathways that may not be obvious in simple diagrams. If a shared management network can reach both in-scope and out-of-scope systems, compromise of that management plane can compromise the CDE even if normal user traffic is segmented. If shared patch management tools, backup systems, or monitoring systems have broad access into the CDE, those systems become critical choke points that must be tightly controlled and may become part of scope. Controls that hold account for these realities by designing dedicated management paths, restricting administrative access, and minimizing the number of systems that can administer the CDE. Beginners often focus on application traffic and forget administrative traffic, but administrative pathways are often the most dangerous because they allow control, not just connection. In assessment thinking, systems that can administer CDE components can impact CDE security, which means they affect both scope and risk. When you architect network security controls to constrain administrative paths, you strengthen both actual security and the defensibility of your compliance conclusions. Remote access deserves special attention because it is one of the most common ways boundaries are bypassed in practice, especially when vendors or distributed teams need access. A remote access solution can be designed as a controlled gateway that enforces strong authentication, limits what can be reached, and logs activity, or it can be a broad corridor that essentially connects external networks directly into internal systems. Controls that hold treat remote access as a privileged pathway that must be narrowed and monitored, not as a convenience feature that grows without oversight. This includes ensuring that remote sessions are restricted to specific systems and functions, and that access is granted only to those with a validated need. It also includes having clear processes for granting and revoking access, because lingering vendor accounts are a common weak point. From a QSA perspective, remote access paths often determine whether segmentation claims are defensible, Because if remote access can reach the CDE from broad networks, the scope story may expand. When remote access is tightly controlled, it becomes one of the strongest supports for a boundary that holds. To ensure controls actually hold, you also need to think about redundancy and failure modes, because controls are not static and systems fail. A boundary that holds should behave safely when something breaks, meaning a failure should not silently open broad access. For example, if a filtering component fails, the environment should not default into an open state where traffic flows freely. This is a conceptual idea about safe failure, not a requirement to design complex infrastructure. But it is important because failures and misconfigurations often create temporary windows of exposure. A QSA will look for evidence that the organization understands how controls fail and has procedures to detect and correct those failures quickly. This might include alerts for rule changes, monitoring for unexpected pathways, and response processes for anomalous flows. Beginners sometimes assume that once a rule exists, it will continue to exist correctly, but real environments evolve and break in unpredictable ways. Architecting controls that hold means anticipating that change and failure will happen and ensuring the control posture remains defensible even then. Evidence strategy is where network security architecture becomes real in assessment terms, because you must be able to show that the controls are not only designed but operating. A strong evidence story typically includes a clear description of network zones and boundaries, documentation of allowed pathways and their rationales, records showing that changes are controlled, and proof that monitoring and reviews occur. It also includes evidence that the segmentation is effective, meaning unauthorized traffic paths are blocked, and that this blocking is validated periodically. The point is not to drown the report in technical detail, but to provide enough evidence linkage that a reader can trust the boundary claims. If the organization claims that only a small set of systems can reach the CDE, the evidence should support that claim in a way that is consistent with the scope statement and the observed architecture. If the evidence is missing, the boundary claim becomes weak and scope reduction becomes risky. Controls that hold are easier to assess because they produce consistent evidence naturally, like regular review artifacts and stable rule sets. When architecture and governance are aligned, evidence becomes a reflection of reality rather than a special effort. A common beginner misunderstanding is thinking that the most complex network design is the most secure, but complexity can be a weakness when it exceeds the organization's ability to manage it. Controls that hold are often simpler and more standardized because simpler designs are easier to understand, easier to monitor, and less likely to accumulate uncontrolled exceptions. Complexity can also hide gaps because when many components interact, people assume someone else understands the full picture. A QSA evaluates not only whether the design could be secure in theory, but whether the organization can operate it securely over time. That includes whether documentation is kept current, whether staff understand rule rationales, and whether change processes are actually followed. A design that is elegant but poorly governed will not hold. A design that is simple but tightly governed can hold very well. Professional assessment thinking values sustainability because sustainability is what protects the CDE between audits, not just during the assessment window. From an exam mindset, network security control questions often test whether you recognize that boundaries must be enforced, monitored, and governed, not just present. Options that focus only on deploying a device without addressing role management, monitoring, or validation are usually weaker because they treat architecture as a one-time purchase. Options that assume segmentation is proven by separate IP ranges or by documentation alone are also usually weaker because they ignore the need for effectiveness proof. Strong options typically emphasize limiting pathways, restricting administrative access, controlling changes, and validating that segmentation works as intended. They also tend to reflect a CDE-centric viewpoint, meaning controls are evaluated based on whether they protect the CDE from influence by broader networks. If you stay anchored to pathways and choke points, you can answer these questions with confidence because you are focusing on the outcome. Does the control truly limit access and influence in a reliable, evidence-supported way? That is what the exam is trying to measure, because that is what the role must deliver in practice. To conclude, Architecting network security controls that actually hold is about designing and maintaining enforced boundaries around the cardholder data environment, CDE, so that only intentional, necessary pathways exist, and those pathways are governed and monitored over time. Controls hold when they are built around least privilege connectivity, supported by visibility that detects stress and drift, and protected by change management that prevents exceptions from quietly becoming permanent holes. They also hold when administrative and management plane pathways are treated as high-impact connections that must be constrained as tightly as normal data paths. Remote access, shared services, and failure modes are common places where boundaries collapse, so a professional approach anticipates those risks and builds governance and evidence around them. The strongest architectures are often those that the organization can operate consistently, because sustainability is what keeps the control posture real between assessments. When you can reason about network security in terms of pathways, choke points, governance, and evidence, you stop being distracted by complexity and start evaluating whether the controls truly support defensible scope and defensible compliance conclusions. That is the difference between controls that exist and controls that actually hold.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.